Guys, boxing gossip here. I'm going to keep the voice down ever so slightly as my girlfriend is sleeping next door and I'm worried about her coming out and doing what Callum Smith just did to Mohoumadi if I wake her up. And yeah, I must say, first and foremost, I quite enjoyed the card tonight. I thought it was some decent action for a Sky Saturday night show. Callum Smith, I thought, put in a class performance against Mohoumadi, you know, a guy who has never been stopped before, a guy who's, you know, done himself justice and went the distance in, you know, against very, very good competition, including our own James DeGale. And Callum Smith just went out and absolutely destroyed him. And for me, the referee was right to jump in when he did. You know, the guy was against the ropes, you know, his head was getting snapped back and not back at all sort of angles. You know, it wasn't pleasant, so the referee was right to jump in. I thought it was a real good performance from Smith though. You know, Mohoumadi came out from the first second and tried to put it on him, and Smith kept defensively sound, you know, kept his patience, didn't feel the need to get off to a fast start and looked to pick his gaps. And you know, you could tell Smith was in a dangerous move when the second the spot came, he started counter-punching, he started landing big counters off this guy's initial attacks. You know, there was no settling in time here, and Smith went about it and, you know, fundamentally destroyed him. And Callum Smith clearly does carry very big power, you know, this is a guy who hasn't been stopped before. He stopped Rocky Fielding in a round last time, and to be honest, as Callum Smith is stepping up in grade and as he's fighting a higher level of opponent, he's actually looking better. He's looking better and better as he moves up, which is a good thing to see. And I was really impressed with the way he took care of business tonight. And the other thing to mention is he clearly is, like, you know, a massive guy at the weight. He looked at least a weight class bigger than his opponent tonight. And I know his opponent weighed in slightly lighter than the super middleweight limit, but, you know, so he's probably not the biggest super middleweight out there, but Callum Smith really is a huge guy at the weight, and that will continue to be relevant as he steps up in class. You know, on the undercard there were two very gritty 12-round fights between Rocky Fielding and Rebrasse and Cardle and Dodd. Starting with Fielding and Rebrasse, I actually had bet on Rebrasse to win. I got 9-2 and just felt that from a value perspective it was too good not to take. However, I did think that the most likely winner was Rocky Fielding, and on balance I do think Fielding deserved to win tonight, although I would say it was very much by the skin of his teeth. Obviously Fielding got dropped early on in the fight, which cost him, you know, a 10-8 round, which made things quite a bit closer. I thought the Sky commentary, as always, was off. I think Jim Watt had him 4 rounds up or something of that nature, which to me seemed frankly ludicrous, especially given the knockdown. You know, it suggested that had the knockdown not taken place, Rebrasse would have only won a couple of rounds in the fight, which I thought was very unfair. For me, had Rebrasse had a bit more power and a bit more pop in his shots, he'd have won this fight, because, you know, Fielding was very defensively inept and Rebrasse was able to continuously back him up to the ropes and, you know, couldn't miss with the straight right. You know, Fielding's chin was up in the air. He was quite upright, Fielding. There wasn't much head movement. He had a high guard, but it was quite a wide guard. You know, you could kind of punch through it, and yeah, his chin was up, limited head movement. It's quite interesting actually, because Christopher Rebrasse, whilst he didn't have the offensive skills probably of Rocky Fielding, defensively he was so superior. You know, his chin was down, he was showing the forehead, very high tight guard, elbows tucked in. You know, he looked a lot smarter defensively than Fielding, and Rebrasse was landing some nice punches. I just felt that Fielding on the whole was doing a better job with the combinations. You know, early on he was landing some decent flurries of punches. He was going to the body quite nicely, and I think towards the end of the fight, rounds 9, 10, 11, and Rebrasse did win the last, but those sort of rounds I was thinking this is a coin toss here, this could go either way, and I think Rebrasse really needed to pull out something to come out away and, you know, take a win off a home fighter, and I don't think he quite did that in this fight, if I'm honest. Elsewhere, I understand Robert Helenius was knocked out by Johan de Par. Haven't been able to watch that fight yet, but I understand de Par broke his nose and knocked him out, which is a major upset, and will be an upset for Helenius' career. And also on the undercard here, Cardle versus Dodd. Now, I didn't actually score the fight because I was eating dinner with my girlfriend at the time. My instinct was that this was a close fight, and I actually edged Scott Cardle without having scored the fight. You know, I thought Scott Cardle was the more eye-catching fighter here, and I thought he was just about doing enough to win the majority of the rounds. I didn't have an argument with the draw. I'll need to go back and watch it again, but there seems to be a bit of uproar at the decision. 2 judges had it a draw. 1 judge had it in favour of Cardle. And for me, Cardle definitely looked the superior boxer in there. Some of the stuff he was doing was quite advanced, but it was a bit of a case of being all style and no substance, which is a recurring issue with Scott Cardle. But you know, he was doing some pretty advanced head movement and some pretty advanced foot movement around the ring, how he was using the ring, and I thought he had more strings to his bow than Sean Dodd. Having said that, he was just not doing some basics very well. His output was too low. You know, there were certain rounds where he gifted Dodd the rounds. I actually didn't think Dodd was doing too much in some of the rounds. You know, he had a good last round. He did well at various points in the fight, but I think the crowd was going mental for him because it was a partisan Scouser crowd. I know he'd sold 1,000 tickets or something of that nature. And you know, he was forcing the pace. He was maybe having a bit more output than Cardle, but I didn't really think Dodd was doing anything too exceptional in there. I thought he was fairly ABC. You know, he was throwing a unexceptional jab that was landing every so often. For me, Cardle did look to be the superior guy. He had the better range of punches. He was the better mover. I felt at times his punches actually looked to be the more powerful. You know, he had a good spell. I think it was the 10th or the 11th round when he was starting to put it on Dodd, and I thought Cardle looked like the one who had the power to change the fight potentially. But the problem with Cardle was, you know, he was doing all this glamorous stuff, all of this, you know, designer movement and designer head movement, but what he needed to do was put his hands in front of his chin. You know, he was doing all of this ducking low and side-to-side head movement, and he was making Dodd miss to an extent, but his hands were down by his waist, and eventually Dodd was able to bust him up and, you know, cut him and score points on him. And when you're a guy like Scott Cardle, who, you know, cuts easily, it's so important to do what you can to stay out of trouble, and the most basic way of staying out of trouble is keeping your hands high. All the head movement, all the foot movement is great, but it's kind of by the by if you're not doing the basics and putting your hands up and defending yourself in that manner. So, yeah, I mean, Scott Cardle did avoid getting sucked into a war here, which is what I was suggesting he needed to do in my pre-fight video. But what he also needed to do was, you know, get the jab moving a bit, try and be more mindful of banking rounds and scoring. You know, he took an early lead. Dodd started coming into the fight, and I just felt Cardle could have really put a stamp on this in the middle to late rounds, you know, around 7 to 10, if he just had a bit more punching output, and if he just kept his defences slightly tighter, the rounds could have gone the other way. But nevertheless, I thought, for me, if I had to pick one of the two, I'd pick Cardle. I thought Dodd was very basic, and I thought was Cardle was making some errors defensively, and was Cardle was not necessarily having as high a punching output as I would like. I thought he was possibly the better and more eye-catching of the two. So there'll probably be a lot of uproar, people saying that Eddie Hearn paid off the judges tonight, but you know, I thought Cardle and Fielding were just about doing enough, and that's as someone who bet on Christopher Rebrasse. You know, the main event, Callum Smith looked really, really good. You know, the opponent, it's hard to know how much to rate him, but he went the distance against James DeGale, and he's performed at a decent level. So, you know, it's a really good piece of form by Callum Smith, whose career seems to be moving in the right direction, and certainly excited to see how it develops over the next year or so. Let me know your thoughts. Did you enjoy the card? If you've enjoyed this, do hit the thumbs up button. Please do subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.